Hey, Average Picker here. So let's dive right into part 2 of making a challenge lock. So one of the things I like to do is I line up the basic pins it came with, kind of play around with them a little bit, but then I like to line up and start giving myself some options and just kind of thinking through some of what the key bitting is going to look like. And what I'm going to do is just kind of look at it, give it a little bit of thought, and draw from these pins. And just kind of play around with that a little bit and try to come up with something. All these were bought on eBay. You can find some really good deals. You can buy by like the pound. And if you don't mind them coming like this and just being a crazy assortment of who knows what, it's a pretty cheap and inexpensive way to get a lot of pins. Either that or you just collect a lot of locks and start gutting them for parts because you've moved beyond them and picking them is no longer a challenge. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm just going to play around with some pin combinations and line up some options here. Okay, so a bit tentatively, this is what I've come up with. And I think for the sake of this video, we're not going to be changing this very much. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these out as kind of potential options, and I'll just throw them into the bin. So I think what we're going to do, so this is basically a zero cut. If we drop it down in here, that's going to be a big high lift on 1. Then we're going to have we'll run a few mediums, and then it's going to reduce a little bit and reduce a little bit more. And this one is not a 0, but it's pretty close. Now, these are the original drivers, and they're a little tiny. They could be a little difficult to work with. We'll probably use a few of them, but what we'll probably end up doing is swapping out a fair number of these. And these guys, we're probably not going to do a whole lot to, but just kind of tip off some serrations on the tops of them, just to get hung up a little bit. And again, we may talk about that in that other video. But yeah, for right now, here's what we've got. So let's get to work. Okay, so we are going to be chucking the pins up in a Dremel. Now, some people will use a drill. That is fine. Other people, even when they're using the Dremel, let me see if I can pull one of these out. They will use one of these little like corlette things. Corlettes, I forget what they're exactly called. Something like these, right? This is a little bit too small, but I've had terrible luck with these as far as just getting them to hold the pins well. I have just not found, I've got a whole selection of these and I've never found a combo that really seems to suit for holding the pin the way I like it. And they can be kind of a pain to work off and on with. So what we're going to use is this little add-on chuck. And this works pretty much like any drill chuck does. You have to hold that button in and you can tighten it up and loosen it. Mine's a little bit worn, so my pieces those little grabbers don't quite fly back like they used to. Now, probably one of the more watched videos out there on turning pins in a Dremel is done by Bosnian Bill, and he has this really convoluted method where you put the Dremel in a clamp and then you hold this button down with another clamp or something, and then you put the pin in and chuck it up. We're not going to do that. You really don't need to. You can do it by hand. And I'm going to film this probably a couple times from a couple different angles. This one's going to be a little difficult just because of the way I have to reach around the camera. But what I do is I start by getting that bit kind of already sized-ish to the pin. So we're a little too small right now. Still a little too small. I'm going to take this off camera for a moment. Just make it a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so we should be pretty close. I found that this could be a little bit easier too if you kind of hold it against your stomach. It just helps stabilize it a little bit. So I'm using my thumb to hold that in. Got the chuck almost to the pin diameter. Pinch it there, and we're just going to give the chuck a little bit of a twist. Now this can be difficult depending on how worn yours is. There we go. Once we've got it a little bit in there, we can let it go. And voila, we have it in there pretty well without having to put a weird clamp to hold down that button. So it is very doable. Okay, so we're gonna do this again, just from a different angle. So again, I've got the chuck almost set to the pin diameter. I'm gonna hold the button down. I'm going to pinch. Pin as far close to the tip of it as I can. Just get a little bit of it in there. And kind of just start giving it a little rotation. And I'm sort of rotating off of this finger and this finger. So I'm pinching it and I've got these on there and I'm kind of turning it. There's some other ways you can kind of hold and manipulate it. You know, you can even get it real close, set to the pin diameter, and just kind of balance it in there. And if you're, you know, can hold it pretty steady and just keep it a little bit balanced, you can just give that last little final bit of twist and it'll just grab it right up and you're good to go. Okay, so one of the things we want to do is we want to maximize our shear line usage, right? We want to get as much pin, cut modified pin in there as we can. So what we're going to do is we're going to just start with one of them, and we're probably going to start initially by making a spool, because a spool is just kind of classic challenge lock, and it's a good place to begin. And I think what we will do is we will put a spool in the second chamber. So what we need to know is how much pin is not going to do any good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the I'm going to take the key pin that we plan to use in chamber 2, and I'm going to load it up into the lock core. And then we're going to take our driver pin that we are going to make our spool out of, and I'm going to put it in there on top. And this is going to be a weird example because you can see there's very little bit of it showing, which means we can use a large portion of that pin. Now what I'm going to do is we are going to mark it. So we're going to get a Sharpie. Okay, and just so you can see this a little bit better, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do our third one. Our third one's not going to be a whole lot of lift. We don't have a whole lot of depth in there, so we will probably still use the stock driver. So I'm going to load that up. So that's what we're looking at as far as 2 and 3, right? So we're taking our Sharpie. I usually tend to use black. We'll see how well red shows up. I just happen to grab it first. And what we're going to do is we're going to mark our shear line on these pins. So now that it looks good and bloody, oh, it really does, doesn't it? We've got kind of a ballpark idea for how much pin we have to work with. So where are the tweezers? Tweezers. When we chuck this pin up, we're going to try to chuck as close to that red line as possible, right? Because we know anything we shape in this section here is going to fall into the shear line, right? And anything that gets marked where it's red is going to be outside the shear line and essentially is not going to come into play. Now, if we were, say, serrating the chambers or something like that, you know, we may want to go ahead and, you know, flip the pin or do something all the way up through this red bit, just because, you know, that can help, you know, catch on some of those cuts if we were modifying the core, but we're not going to be doing that. Okay, so we're pretty much ready to start on our spool. Just for a point of reference, so this is my Dremel settings, and we are going to be shaping, it goes down like that. We're going to be shaping pretty much all the way down here, somewhere right in there. That's where we're going to be running it. And we're going to start well, we could start several places. We started with the needle or jewelry file. It would take an awful lot of time as far as going back and forth on this thing to get that form. These are really awesome, but they are pretty slow at it. So we're going to step up and we're going to use this guy. Now we do have to worry about the direction of this. So our Dremel is going to be turning that way, and we're just going to be running the file across the top of it that way. One other thing to point out, we're using a round file here. You don't have to. You could easily come in, using the edge of something like that and cut it a little bit as a sharper spool. Using the circular one, of course, it's going to mimic that circular pattern, so it's going to give our spool a bit of an hourglass shape. Now, if we need to or want to, we can come in and take that off later using one of the jewelry saws or even the razor blade or something like that if we wanted to. We're just going to go with this for now. That was a bit of a mistake. I didn't really want to take off from the top, but we just did a little bit, so. Now normally I like to look at these under my magnifying light, but the iPad does a pretty good job of bringing us up close to it. So we've got kind of our start of our spool. I'm going to come in with this, fine tune it a little bit. So one important thing to remember is when you're doing them in a chuck, if you're applying pressure, try to apply it down towards the chuck, not up and away. If you start doing stuff like that, or if you're kind of pulling and lifting, especially if you're trying to round off this tip or something, you have the potential of shooting the pin out of the chuck, right? This way, the only thing really we may do is end up scooting it down a little bit deeper in there. You know what, it's looking okay-ish, but I think I do want to get down in there a little bit more and give it a little more definition as opposed to this hourglass shape. So we are going to come in with a different file. It's still a little bit hourglassed. We'll see what we can do about that. So we've lost our hourglass shape, but we still got this going on. I think I kind of want it squared off a little more. And that's looking kind of neat. So that was just using the razor blade. I'm going to switch tools only for the sake of showing you another thing you can do with the jewelry saws. So this is going to be very similar to what we were just doing with the razor blade, but I'm going to come in and cut down towards the pin this way. Looks pretty good. Kind of liked having that little lump on it though, but you know, for the sake of the video, we took it off. So now we're just going to give it a little bit of a polish. Now sometimes I will come in with the jewelry files or the needlepoint files and do that, but I don't really want to take that much more material off. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with my worn out 600 grit. But again, this is really worn out, so we're not really dealing with 600 grit. And I could live with that pretty easily. So there we go. There is our spool. And after we got it out of the chuck, we are going to place it there so we can remember where it is we wanted it. Also take a look and see how far down that's going to sit. If I didn't mix anything up, it should be the one sitting really low. Yep, there we go. Nice and low, and you can see we've got our entire spool in play. Our little red mark is still just barely visible there. So it's kind of nice because we're actually going to have a little bit of the normal diameter of the pin at play. So as it lifts, it'll actually lift through that, drop down, and then come back to the pin, which does give us our entire spool. That'll be kind of cool. Okay, again, don't want the video to run too long, so we're gonna leave off this part here, and we'll get to doing some other pins. I don't know if I'm gonna show every single pin, but I will make sure that if we do anything new to any of them, if we cut a T-pin or something like that, or just do some serrations, we will come in and look at how it's done and do some close-up work on it. So there we go, guys. In the meantime, everyone have a good one.